I am one of those people who just did not really enjoy being pregnant. I dealt with terrible nausea throughout most of both of my pregnancies, and I was always tired. It wasn't until after I had both of my girls and got diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder that I actually started to learn about the power of food, hydration, and finding true balance in my body. When Elizabeth Newton, a registered dietitian and a previous client of mine, reached out with the idea of discussing tips for dealing with pregnancy fatigue, I was thrilled. Elizabeth is a prenatal nutrition specialist and the owner of Well Fed Mamas, where she specializes in optimizing pregnancy and energy through real food and holistic wellness. I can't wait for you to hear our conversation. Before I dive in, though, I just want to note that everything that Elizabeth shares today is intended to be educational and should not be considered medical advice. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. Well, hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining me today. You are a previous client of mine, and since we work together, you've founded your own business. And I was so thrilled when you reached out about connecting on the topic of pregnancy fatigue, because that was a big struggle for me personally and for many of my friends and clients. But before we dive in, the first question I always like to ask my guests is what inspired you to pursue your vocation and to start your business?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I love this topic. So, I've been a dietitian since 2013, and I spent quite a few years working at an outpatient nutrition clinic, the UVA Nutrition Counseling Center. And I was seeing a whole lot of different conditions, but there wasn't anything that really drew me in as something that was my favorite thing, something I was really passionate about. And then in 2017, I got pregnant and I started doing some extra digging, thinking, okay, I need to really dive in and understand how to optimally nourish my body in pregnancy. And it just got me thinking that I was a dietitian and I wasn't totally sure how to nourish my body in pregnancy. And it just made me think, okay, I think a lot of women need more support here, especially when I started looking at the research and realizing that there was a whole lot of information that wasn't being shared with women in standard prenatal care. And so when I started looking at the research and also realizing that the guidelines weren't up to date with what more current research was showing in certain areas, it really lit a fire under me because I was like, this is one of the most nutritionally demanding periods of a woman's life where it's so important how she fuels her body. And that has such a huge impact on her health and her baby's health. And so I started seeing more clients at UVA, and I actually helped develop a prenatal nutrition program with their wellness program, Who's Well, for employees and their spouses. And whenever I saw a client who was pregnant, it just filled my cup. Like it just energized me. I loved it. And I was like, okay, this is something I really love. I would love eventually to have a business where I was just serving pregnant women. And I had always dreamed of having my own private practice. And then in 2020, I got that push when I found out I was pregnant with twins. And I was like, okay, this is my opportunity. Like, I want to start my own thing so I have more flexibility to spend time with my family and just really focus on this area. So I definitely haven't looked back. I just love how when I serve pregnant women, I'm impacting them, of course, but I'm also impacting their baby's health. And I also think that women tend to be the backbone of a family. And so when you're nourishing and really looking out for the wellness and health of a mom, it has this ripple effect on the whole family. So, yeah, I love this area.
I couldn't agree more. And as you were talking, it was making me think that I suspect this area is somewhat similar to sleep, where a lot of parents will go, including myself when I had my first, to the pediatrician to ask about sleep. And what they don't realize is that the vast majority of pediatricians only receive a few hours of training during medical school around sleep. They're solving big problems. And most pediatricians have not gotten a lot of education on sleep. And I am guessing, and maybe you can help clarify this, that might be the case with our OBGYNs, where we are expecting and we're going and assuming that they would tell us if we needed to fuel our body differently. And is it fair to say, or maybe you don't know, but that is not an area where they've received a lot of training?
Yes, 100%. They don't get a lot of education in nutrition. No doctors do, actually. It's sort of similar to what you said with sleep. And so that's where it's so helpful to work with a dietitian as well and have that support, because my sole focus is nutrition. And I have a background in biology and organic chemistry and physiology. So I do understand how the body works, but I'm really focused on the more current research on nutrition. And that's a beast in itself.
Absolutely.
OBs are trying to keep up with a lot of information.
Right. It kind of falls into that. It takes a village. So it just takes a village. And I know it's exhausting for people to think about getting all of these different experts, but it's so helpful. And I am very passionate about fueling our body with the right food and nutrition. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you. So let's dive in. When you meet with an expecting mom and she starts by telling you she is super tired, what is one of the first things that you recommend?
Yes, great question. So fatigue is a very multifactorial thing. There are a lot of things that can impact our energy levels. I would be looking at a lot of these different factors, from diet to supplements to sleep, stress levels, any labs. But absolutely one of the first areas I'm going to focus on is electrolyte intake, because this can have such a big impact. And I've found that a lot of moms don't realize that they need more electrolytes when they're pregnant. We tend to think of athletes needing a lot more of electrolytes, certain populations, but pregnancy doesn't tend to be one that comes up, even though it's really an area where we need to focus hard on those things to make sure moms are getting enough.
Yes, it's funny because I realized I was pregnant with my second daughter because I was sitting in my office and could not quench my thirst. And I remember thinking, gosh, I haven't been this thirsty and felt so blah since I was, since I was pregnant. I went home that day and took a pregnancy test before I called the doctor's office, and they said, what? You could have conceived that early? And yes, I did. But it was because I was so thirsty, and I felt that way throughout both of my pregnancies and never really thought much of it, other than they always told me to drink more. If you're thirsty, drink more water, and you need to drink more water. But where I really started to learn about electrolytes and salt, which I also want to talk to you a little bit about specifically, was when I cleaned up my diet after getting diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder. And I really started to want to understand, how did I get here, and how am I going to naturally heal my body? And during that process of eliminating a lot from my diet, I was so tired. And I remember talking to my best friend, who, like me, is a super curious nerd. And she had already gone down this path of really cleaning up her diet. And I was telling her how much I was dragging and how it felt not right because I was eating so clean and I was totally dragging, and I didn't have my next appointment with my functional practitioner for several weeks. And she said, I bet you need electrolytes, and maybe you should start with just salt. And we can dive into that a little bit more. But it was an instant fix. So I have no doubt that my pregnancies could have gone a little smoother if I had been targeting my electrolyte intake a little bit more. And so let's just talk about electrolytes, because I think many of us, at least those of us who grew up playing sports, think electrolytes like drinking Gatorade. Like, how exactly are we getting these electrolytes? So can you explain what are electrolytes and why is it so important to monitor electrolytes during your pregnancy?
Sure. I think that's a great place to start because we're kind of going back a long way to like high school biology, right? So electrolytes are these essential minerals, and they're located in your blood and other body fluids, and they carry an electrical charge and they help kick off reactions in your body. I like to think of them sort of like spark plugs, where they're helping our enzymes to function and kick off these reactions. So it's so hard to cover everything that they have their hands in, but they're involved in different processes from energy production to blood sugar regulation to hormones to digestion. The major ones are sodium, chloride, potassium, and magnesium. And when you're pregnant, you're undergoing this massive increase in fluid volume, right? To support the growth of your baby, your placenta, your amniotic fluid. So a lot of people are aware that they need to drink more water in pregnancy. But what I often see is that they're not also increasing their electrolyte intake. And when your fluid needs go up, your electrolyte needs go up as well. So this is huge. And we need to really focus on these things, sodium, potassium, and magnesium in particular, and make sure that we're getting enough of those.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sodium or salt and electrolytes. So, is it as simple for some people as adding more salt, or do you need that combo of those items you just mentioned? Help us understand all of those links.
Yes. So, salt is a major source of two of your major electrolytes, sodium and chloride. Sodium works very closely with other electrolytes, particularly potassium. So it's not as simple as just saying, okay, I'm going to have more salt. We want to really focus on how can I get more of all of these electrolytes because they work so closely together. And if we're increasing one significantly, say sodium, but we're not paying attention to our potassium and magnesium, it can cause more problems and it can kind of create more imbalances since these things work together so closely.
And so when you think about adding electrolytes, do you think people have to have all these levels tested, or is there a safe way that they can just get started? Because I know that's a stumbling block for many
Yes.
people, is the fear, how do I do this safely? Particularly when you're pregnant. I think we overanalyze everything we're doing when we're pregnant. We don't want to do anything wrong.
That's a great question. One thing I will note is that our bodies keep these electrolytes very tightly regulated in our blood. So if you were to go get like a basic metabolic panel and you see your sodium, your potassium, those should be in normal ranges, regardless of whether or not you are getting enough salt or enough potassium, for example, because they have to be in very tight ranges for things like muscle contractility, nerve impulses, our heart beating. So that's not going to be very helpful just looking at a panel like that. I would say almost every pregnant person is going to benefit from increasing their electrolyte intake, but doing it in a way that you're getting some of everything. So you want more salt, absolutely. Salt is important in pregnancy in particular because you need that blood volume expansion to support placental growth and function. And obviously, we know the placenta is so important for getting nutrients to baby. And there's actually research that shows that women who don't eat enough sodium in pregnancy are more likely to have low birth weight infants. So a lot of people just don't realize these things or make these connections, but salt is so important to get more of. And I like to see women, as they increase their salt intake, get more potassium and more magnesium as well because they work together.
And as you're talking, I'm thinking it's been a long time since I've looked at a prenatal vitamin. And when I took them, I'm going to be real honest. They told me to take one. I bought some. I took them. I didn't even look at the ingredients because this was before I was curious about this whole area. So, is any of this covered in a prenatal vitamin?
Oh, good question. So, something like sodium and potassium are not really going to be in prenatal vitamins. You're going to see some magnesium.
Enough magnesium or no?
Depends on the brand of the prenatal.
Okay.
We could really get into a long discussion about choosing a prenatal vitamin. I will say I've seen a good amount of magnesium in maybe 2 to 3 of the higher quality ones out there. If you're going to go buy a prenatal from Target or CVS or, your grocery store, it's definitely not going to have enough magnesium in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is where it just gets so tricky.
Mm-hmm.
So, from what you're saying, it sounds like people don't need to be on edge about the fear of adding too much electrolytes to their diet. Or I guess maybe I should rephrase it. How, if there is the potential of adding too much, and I definitely want to ask you about different electrolytes you like, but how would we know if we've added too much?
This is tricky. So I'm going to say if you are adding more electrolytes from whole foods, you're going to be pretty safe there. For example, if you're trying to get more high quality salt in your diet and you're also adding more potassium rich foods such as potatoes or avocados or winter squash or beans, if you're getting more of those potassium rich foods in tandem with getting more high quality salt, you're probably not going to go wrong there. Magnesium, I really like it just depends on the person. Because here's where it gets tricky. For example, with magnesium, if you're supplementing with a lot of magnesium, it can deplete your sodium. And so if you're already in a place where you need more sodium, like say you're pregnant and you're stressed out and maybe you're active and you're not getting enough sodium, and then you're taking say 400 milligrams a day of magnesium, that can make the situation worse. So that's where it can be helpful to work with someone. It's just going to depend on your diet. But it's almost always safe to play around with getting more from whole foods. And whole foods in their natural forms are typically mineral rich in a lot of these things together. Mother Nature's very smart. So you're not going to be creating imbalances there.
Oh, this could take us on a whole nother path about how our food has changed, but I won't go there. We will leave that for another day. So I want to talk a little bit more about salt because I think salt is misunderstood. And when I was growing up, at least in my household, it had a bad rap because my dad had high cholesterol. And so there was always this talk about reducing salt, and he needed to eat less salt, and it was going to help with his cholesterol. And as I've learned more about salt over the last, 3 to 5 years, I've come to realize that it's very misunderstood. So can you talk a little bit about the misconceptions about salt and what you wish everybody, specifically every pregnant woman, knew about salt to relieve their brain of things they maybe learned growing up?
Yes. And I love this question. It's a loaded one because I think we could talk for 2 or 3 hours about just this topic, but I'll try to keep it brief here. Salt definitely tends to get a bad rap in the conventional nutrition world. And I think it's very misunderstood because it is so crucial for our normal body functioning. And a lot of people, when they think about salt, they immediately think blood pressure or heart health, like you mentioned with your dad. But with salt, we have to look at it in the context of the entire diet and with other minerals too. So, what you tend to see in a standard American diet is people are consuming a lot of salt from processed foods, which is, standard table salt. It's highly processed and it doesn't have its other little mineral buddies in there that help it do its job. And you tend to see people not eating enough potassium. So this is a setup for, higher blood pressure or health issues. But if we are balancing these minerals together, and for example, I'll see people who are eating a very high quality whole foods diet, right? They're not eating a lot of processed food. But if they're not adding salt to their food, they're not going to be getting enough because a lot of the processed foods have that salt added in. So some of the functions of salt, it helps regulate our fluid balance and our blood pressure. It's really important for stomach acid production, which, oh gosh, that is so important for digestion and absorption of your nutrients. In pregnancy, it's really important for fetal growth and development, like I mentioned earlier. And reducing salt to lower blood pressure is actually very outdated advice, and it's not based on a solid amount of evidence. Studies have shown that higher salt intake during pregnancy can actually lower blood pressure and can prevent preeclampsia. And there's even some research showing that treating preeclamptic women with very high amounts of salt, like we're talking about 4 teaspoons a day, can actually reduce the symptoms of it. So it's kind of wild because I'll get a lot of people thinking, oh, I have a history of preeclampsia or I'm worried about my blood pressure, I should restrict my salt. And the reality is the opposite is true. There is truly a reason for women craving salt in pregnancy. I think our bodies are so smart. And especially if that's you, if you're craving those salty foods, those pickles or fermented vegetables, things like that, like go with that. I think it's your body's way of letting you know that that's what it needs. But yeah, I think consuming enough salt as part of a nutrient dense whole foods diet is so important. And salt should not be limited in pregnancy. We actually need to be smart about adding more in the right way.
I am so struck by what you just said because I have no doubt that there are women who have a history of preeclampsia who have not heard this. So for those of you listening who've been multitasking, because that's what us moms do, I really want everyone to tune back in and register what Elizabeth just said, because this is one of those, I would say, kind of aha moments that could absolutely change someone's journey during their pregnancy.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll note is gestational diabetes. That's one of the most common pregnancy complications, right? Well, salt is also really important for insulin sensitivity and getting blood sugar into our cells. And so if a woman is more prone to, developing gestational diabetes, maybe she has a history of it, or she had, pre-diabetes prior to getting pregnant, and she's restricting her salt intake, that can make the blood sugar situation worse as well. So it's kind of crazy how much salt impacts our bodies and our whole body systems. But yes, please, if you're pregnant, eat more salt. Salt your food.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of it.
I had asked my functional practitioner when we were increasing my salt intake, could I oversalt my food? Luckily, I love salt, so I can salt the heck
Me
out
too.
of anything. And she said, no, because you've basically removed processed foods from your diet. And so she said, the way you eat, cannot over salt your food. So I just salt with joy. I salt everything. I just salt away. And I think the big takeaway there is less processed foods. And I notice, it's funny because I salt things to the point where I'm sure people who don't love salt are like, whoa, it is so salty. But then if I eat processed foods, even let's say I ate a pizza from a restaurant, or just a lot of restaurant food sometimes, but any sort of processed food or chips or anything, I am insanely thirsty, which is interesting because I could salt the heck out of my food and it does not affect how thirsty I am. But anytime I eat really processed foods, and so I'm curious, is that just a different process? Why would those processed foods make me more thirsty?
Yes, I think there's two things going on there. One, the processed foods have your standard table salt in there, which has been highly refined and stripped of some of those trace minerals that you're going to find in something like a Himalayan pink salt or the Redmond's real salt. Some of these
I love Redmond's.
Oh, me too. Yes. And so that's one piece. And another piece is if you're eating more of a whole foods diet and you're including, say, fruits and starchy veggies that are very potassium rich, that's going to be helping the salt do what it needs to do in your body. Versus if you're eating more highly processed foods from a restaurant, you're not going to be getting much potassium. That's where those imbalances can happen if we're just getting one thing, such as salt, but we're not balancing out with that potassium or that magnesium.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about types of salt. So you mentioned Redmond's. I also love Redmond's. I got hooked on Redmond's after I started my journey of cleaning up my body. And so if someone's thinking, okay, great, I'm going to increase my salt intake, what types of salt do you like and recommend?
Yeah, I would look for something that's unrefined and higher quality. So the Redmond's real salt I'm a big fan of that one. Celtic sea salt is another nice one, or the Himalayan pink salt. So these salts haven't been refined and stripped of those trace minerals, and they're just going to affect your body in a different way than the table salt will. And some people will bring up, okay, but what about iodized salt? Do I need to get iodine? And yes, iodine is extremely important nutrient that I think is often underconsumed, particularly in pregnancy. But you can get iodine from things like sea vegetables or seafood. Low mercury seafood in pregnancy is preferred. People often overestimate how much they're getting from something like an iodized salt. By the time that iodized salt has sat and you're finally using it, it actually doesn't have a whole lot of iodine. So I wouldn't worry about getting iodine from your salt. I would focus on getting it from other things in your diet. Dairy is going to have some iodine, eggs, particularly seafood. And using those high quality salts, like I mentioned, it's definitely going to have a different effect on your body. I love that you've noticed eating in a restaurant a more processed food versus using your salt shaker at home has a difference.
Night and day. It's so interesting. And it's pregnancy would be a hard time to really delve into listening to your body because there's so much. And I think we're just on edge about everything. But having learned to listen to my body, it has made me realize how much I was ignoring things before. You're just kind of clipping along and not realizing that, your body's constantly talking. And you mentioned, sometimes cravings, it's your body telling you you're short on something or something deficient in some way. But now I'm quite in tune to listening to how my body responds to things I eat. Doesn't mean I always make the right choice, but at least I understand why it's happening. I find it very empowering to know, oh, I'm so thirsty tonight because I decided to chow down on whatever random thing I probably shouldn't have been eating. Interesting. So when we think about if someone just wants to have a practice of adding electrolytes like I do every day, so I have an electrolyte drink, I use LMNT
Mhm.
at least once a day, depending kind of what I'm doing that day. But let's talk about some ways for people to kind of have an electrolyte drink. So beyond just doing salt, do you like the packs? Do you want people to kind of go their own route? Do you have a strong preference that it really just needs to be through food? Tell me how we feel about that.
Yeah, so I love electrolyte drinks and I still do. I'm not pregnant or breastfeeding anymore, but I still do one per day and I really notice a difference in how it makes me feel. I really love making my own, but I also, it's just going to depend on the person, right? Because some people want the convenience of just, I open up this powder, I pop it in my water bottle, I shake and I go. And certain ones are going to have different amounts of these electrolytes. So, element, which you were talking about, I can see how that would work so well for you if you really need more salt. That's a very salty one. I do like it for pregnancy because women do need more salt in pregnancy. If you're not pregnant or breastfeeding, that could be a bit salty for you, and you might want to try a different one. When you look at these powders, you really want to check the ingredients list and try to make sure that it's as minimal ingredients as possible. And especially during pregnancy, I don't like to see a lot of artificial sweeteners, things like that. If it's something like stevia or monk fruit, those are safe for pregnancy. Those are okay. But something like aspartame or sucralose, I would stay away from. And the ratios, it's just going to depend. I will say, Allison, I saw some really great advertising on Instagram for this one brand that I won't name, but they were like, oh, we use organic ingredients. And I went to look at how much sodium and potassium was in this because I was like, oh, I'm intrigued. Could this be another brand? And it was like, I don't know, 40 milligrams of potassium and maybe like 30 milligrams of sodium. I mean, it was just such negligible amounts. I was like, man, people are paying like
Big bucks.
$2, right? For this packet of almost nothing. So it's hard to give, again, this is going to depend on the person. It's hard to give exact guidelines here, but I would say I would look for at least 200 milligrams of potassium in
Okay.
these drinks. And if you're pregnant, something saltier like Element, that has 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And some people are like, oh my gosh, that's so much. But again, when you're pregnant, you need more salt. And so adding that to, I think most people find that, I don't know what your ratio that you like, Allison, but for me, when I use Element, I need like 32 ounces of water.
Oh, I got to have the full water bottle because it's intense.
Yes, it is very salty. I mean, they say that too, like it's salty. But there's other brands like Needed has one. I actually have one here, and the Needed one has magnesium in it, which I love. It's got
Mm.
150 milligrams of magnesium. It's got 250 milligrams of potassium and 250 milligrams of sodium. So that's a nice one too. I mean, I could definitely like more sodium in it for pregnancy. They do tend to advertise this one for pregnancy. But yeah, it's just going to depend on the person and what your total diet looks like. And for you, Allison, I think it's amazing. You need more salt, and something like Element works well. But maybe for someone who doesn't need quite as much salt, they might look for something else.
Yeah. And tell me what you think about the old school back in the day. It was like drink your Gatorade or Powerade, which now I would never do. So if someone has that old school mindset of like, well, just, I'm feeling a little low, I'll grab that Gatorade at the gas station. What do we think about that?
Yes. I mean, I don't want to totally demonize any food. I think we have to look at it in the context of what are you doing every day, right? So if it's a one off and you want to grab some Gatorade at the gas station and that's going to be your electrolytes, go for that if that's what you need that day. But on a day to day basis, I wouldn't recommend something like that just because of the other ingredients that are in there and colorings and
Exactly. That's the
other
stuff I
yucky
think we
stuff.
high in sugar and
The sugar too. Yeah. Yes. But, I don't think I mentioned my DIY recipe. So what I tend to do is I do 2 to 4 ounces of orange juice, which is very high potassium. I do another like 4 ounces of coconut water, also very high potassium. And then I do a quarter teaspoon of the Redmond's real salt. And I shake that up, and that works for me. I did more sodium when I was pregnant, and especially when I was breastfeeding. I just really knew that I needed more salt. I craved it, and I listened to that. But yeah, again, it's going to depend on what you are looking for. And maybe if you're traveling, you pick up some of the packets. But if you're at home and you want to make your own, that can work.
Awesome. Okay, so one thing that I am curious about, because for me, when I was feeling really low and then I started with Redmond salt, and what I did was literally take a teaspoon of salt. So I would pinch it, put it under my tongue, chug water, get it down.
Wow.
Very quickly, I felt better. I can't remember now. This was several years ago. If it was within an hour, it was a very quick turnaround that I felt my energy come back, that I felt a little less nauseous, and it answered my suspicion very quickly, or I should say my best friend's suspicion that I needed more salt. If a woman, let's come back to my original question, because man, I really took us down a journey here on the salt and electrolytes. If a woman is pregnant and feeling fatigue and she's listening and thinking, maybe this could help me, maybe I need more electrolytes, salt, whatever it may be, should they see a quick fix here if this is a big driver of their fatigue?
Yes, if this is a big driver, if you start to add more electrolytes, you can notice an increase in your energy levels pretty quickly. It's pretty amazing that you notice it that quickly. I would say most people, when I'm working with them and we start to add more electrolytes, they notice it in a couple of days. But it depends on the person. And, if you're very depleted and you start adding these things in, you can absolutely notice a difference. I will say it can be good to go slow just to see how your body responds. So just starting by adding a little salt to your food, or add one of these electrolyte drinks and give it a few days and see how you feel and go from there. Your body's going to let you know how it's doing.
Awesome. Well, this has been so interesting, and we really just took a deep dive into one area of things that could cause fatigue during pregnancy. And I know you could go on and on about all the other areas. And so if someone is interested in connecting with you, can you tell them how they could find you?
Absolutely. So I'm pretty active on Instagram. My business is called Well-Fed Mamas. And so I'm at Well-Fed Mamas on Instagram. You can also check out my website. I've got a lot of information about how I work with women there, and that's wellfedmamas.com. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'd love to connect, reach out.
Okay, great. And we will definitely link to that in the show notes. And before we wrap up, any final thoughts, or if there's one thing you hope an expecting mom takes away from this episode, what would it be?
I would say that you absolutely need more electrolytes when you're pregnant, and that there's no need to fear salt, but we also need to think about how are we getting in more potassium? How are we getting in more magnesium? And I would also say these electrolytes are super important for lactation as well. So if you're planning on breastfeeding your baby, getting this on point while you're pregnant can be so helpful. I know when I was nursing my twins, I felt like I needed like 2 or 3 of those electrolyte drinks a day to keep up, because, a lot of those things are going into your breast milk. So keeping that in mind is helpful as well. That's such an underappreciated time with nutrition too, where it's so important, but most women aren't getting hardly any education on postpartum nutrition.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for allowing me to take you down this rabbit hole of all things electrolytes and salt. And Thank you for all that you do to support moms. It's an area of passion for me. And so I am glad that you have found your way into this sector.
Me too. I love it. Thank you so much for having me, Allison. I enjoyed the conversation. I love rabbit holes, so it was fun.
All right. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, pleep and wellnesscoach.com.